अम्बेडकर को। राउंड टेबल कॉन्फ्रेंस और जो स्पीच हम पढ़ने जा रहे हैं, ये स्पीच डॉक्टर भीमराव अंबेडकर, जिनको कि प्यार से हम बाबा साहब अंबेडकर बोलते हैं, उन्होंने 20 नवंबर 1930 को दिया था। ये प्लेनरी सेशन था 5th सिटिंग का, और उसका दूसरा भाग हम पढ़ रहे हैं, स्पीचेस एट राउंड टेबल कॉन्फ्रेंसेस। राउंड टेबल कॉन्फ्रेंस एक भाग पहले पढ़ चुके हैं और ये शुरू होता है पेज नंबर। इसमें अलग अलग किताबों में अलग अलग पेज हो सकते हैं, और मैं जो पढ़ रही हूँ वो क्रिटिकल क्वेस्ट की किताब है, जो कि मात्र 30 रुपए में मिलती है, और स्पीचेस एट राउंड टेबल कॉन्फ्रेंस करके बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर का खुद का इसमें राइटिंग है। चलिए पढ़ते हैं। प्रोविंशियल ऑटोनॉमी टू बी लिमिटेड इन द इंटरेस्ट ऑफ माइनॉरिटीज। सब कमिटी नंबर 2 ऑन प्रोविंशियल कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, फर्स्ट सिटिंग ऑन 4th दिसंबर 1930। ये शुरू होता है कोट से, बाबा साहब की खुद की स्पीच है। कोट, आई प्रपोज टू डिवाइड माई रिमार्क्स अंडर 3 heads. 1. Provincial autonomy. 2. Responsibility in the provinces. 3. Provincial services. I make a distinction between provincial autonomy and provincial services. It seems to me that the question of provincial autonomy raises the definition of relations of the provincial executive and legislature vis-a-vis the central government and the central legislature. The first remark I would offer with the attitude of those who hold that the time has arrived when the provincial governments ought to be left with as complete an autonomy as is possible under the circumstances, and they should be free from such control as the central government now exercises. But, sir, I cannot help making this further observation, that viewing the problems of provincial autonomy from the standpoint of particular class I represent in this conference and of the interest of India as a whole and the working class in particular, I think that in my future constitution that we propose to devise for enduring the provinces with provincial autonomy, we must take into consideration certain facts which are bound to limit the characters of that autonomy. The first limiting factor in the provincial autonomy is that it must be made subject to such questions of a provincial character which are, although provincial in nature, also of an all-India character. The provinces may have their say with regard to these subjects, and yet the central government should not be excluded from its jurisdiction with regard to them. For instance, I would like to draw an illustration from labor legislation affecting tenants and affecting agriculture. These, no doubt, in a country like India, must become provincial subject, yet I do not think they can be viewed entirely from such a small compass. They cannot be regarded as entirely provincial and without an all-India character. The central government must have some jurisdiction over subject of this character, notwithstanding that it cuts across provincial autonomy. Secondly, I should state that in dividing the powers of government between the central and the provincial governments in future Constitution of India with a view to giving the provinces as complete and autonomy as possible, it will also be necessary that such powers as remain undefined must be left with the central government. Well, I do not think that there is no other view on that point, but I say that in the present situation, I would like to draw an illustration from labor legislation affecting tenants and affecting agriculture. These, no doubt, in a country like India, must become provincial subject, yet I do not think they can be viewed entirely from such a small compass. They cannot be regarded as entirely provincial and without an all-India character. The central government must have some jurisdiction over subject of this character, notwithstanding that it cuts across provincial autonomy. Secondly, I should state that in dividing the powers of government between the central and the provincial governments in future Constitution of India with a view to giving the provinces as complete and autonomy as possible, it will also be necessary that such powers as remain undefined must be left with the central government. Well, I do not think that there is no other view on that point, but I say that in the present situation in India, where the separatist tendency exists to such an extent as we all know it, where provincial and local parochialism the local parochialism is more dominant than national feeling. While we are building up a federated India with the complete autonomy of the units, we still have the problem of making India as a whole and a strong and united country. I would make this further observation, namely that I do not think that the reservation of powers in the central government is likely to affect the autonomy of the province. The reservation of powers as interested by Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the case of Canada has not had this overriding effect. It means a power that comes into existence in an emergency in a field not specifically allotted to the provinces. I do not think that the provincial autonomy should be really affected. The second thing I should like to observe in connection with this question of provincial autonomy is that autonomy must be limited by the affording of protection for the interest of minority and of the depressed class. As I visualize the situation in India as it will result from the new constitution, I find there will be certain provinces in which some committees will be in a majority. But in all the provinces, the depressed classes whom I represent will be in a minority. They will be in a minority in every province. I cannot understand how we can at this point permit the provincial majority to have a complete uninterrupted and undiluted sway over the destinies of these poor people without any right of appeal being given to the latter in regard to maladministration or neglect of their interest. There must be some authority somewhere over and above the provincial government which will be in a position to intervene and rescue them from any adverse position in which they may be placed by the provincial majorities. These are the three things which, in my opinion, at any rate must limit the autonomy of the future provincial government of India. Coming to the question of the character of responsibility in the provincial governments, my first observation is that the whole question of responsibility in the provincial legislatures is entirely dependent upon the kind of legislature that you are going to get in provinces. If the legislature that you are going to get in the provinces is a legislature which is going to be mirror of the whole population of the province, if it is going to be thoroughly representative and not merely representative as a museum, is where there is a few specimens of every species for the observation of the general onlookers. If every minority and every class which fear its existence will be jeopardized is placed on a position to make its influence felt, then I think in a legislature of that sort there will be no harm in conceding the principles that provincial responsibility may be introduced to the fullest extent. That is my first observation. Making that condition that the legislature should be fully and adequately representative of all classes, I see no objection to the subjects which are now reserved being transferred to popular control. Coming to the question of whether the responsibility in the provinces should be joint or should be individual, I have not the slightest hesitation in saying that the responsibility not only should be joint but must be joint. I have been a member of Legislative Council and I have seen how ministers in the provinces have worked. It has been a most painful experience for me as it has been the experience, I believe, of many of those who have had the misfortune or the good fortune to be member of the Legislative Council to find out that ministers have been working as a kind of loose confederation without having any complete or unanimous view on a particular policy which they adopted. They have been divided councils and cases of ministers not being very willing to support each other. What has been the result? The result is this, that in no instances have we had any considered policy put forward by the cabinet as a whole, worked out in detail and placed before the Legislative Council. Things have been done by fits and starts, and I do not think we want our responsibility in future to be bungled in the fashion. Turning now to the question of communal representation in the cabinets, I must confess that I am not very much drawn to the suggestion, which is often made, that there should be a communal representation in the cabinet. I'm not, of course, oblivious of the fact. In fact, I'm very conscious of it that if the minority committees are not represented in the cabinet, it is very possible that even very likely that in the matters of administration which affect their daily lives, their interest may be affected very prejudicially by the policy of ministers whose dominant interest is communalism. I do not forget that for a moment, but my submission is that there is a better way of dealing with that sort of evil. And it seems to me that if the minorities could get constitutional and statutory guarantees laid down in the Constitutional Act itself against anything likely to injure the interest being done or left undone by the cabinet. The danger which most of us apprehended from the fact that the cabinets may be communally dominated, will vanish, and we shall not have much to insist on communal representation in the cabinet. Although I am very desirous to that the chief minister, whoever he is, should recognize or should be made to recognize the interest of having most of the important minorities represented in the cabinet. We cannot for the matter forget that after all, a cabinet officer is very responsible office. A cabinet minister had not merely to look after the interest of the minorities, he has to see the safety and interest of the provinces as a whole. That demands ability and competence. It does not merely demand a communal outlook, as it is from the point of view that I look at the matter. I should like to have the interest of the minorities and the depressed classes safeguarded in such a manner that constitutionally it would be impossible for ministers draw from the majority communities to do anything prejudicial to the minorities or the neglect their interest. Coming to the question of the relations between the government and his ministry, I think one thing is obvious, namely that no constitution, if it is really to embody full responsible government and collective responsibility, can permit the government the power to interfere in the day-to-day administration of the country. That would run quite across the system of responsible government and collective responsibility. The ministry must be allowed to carry on day-to-day administration on the basis of joint responsibility. When we come to the question of the emergency power, which is it suggested should be left with the governor, I find myself in a somewhat difficult position because I do not understand exactly what is meant. Is it mean that when the emergency arises, the government should simply dismiss the ministry and have nothing to do with, and should promulgate whatever laws, ordinances and measures he thinks are necessary to meet the situation, notwithstanding the fact that they are opposed by the ministry? I do not know what is wanted. I can quite understand the government should have the absolute, undoubted and unrestricted power of dismissing a minister which he thinks is not acting in best interest of the country. But I cannot understand how there can be responsible government in a province in which the governor is allowed to do a thing without a ministry. It is one thing to say that a governor should have a ministry with which he agrees in a particular emergency, but it is quite a different thing to say that when an emergency arises, the governor should simply disregard the ministry altogether. I think this point will have to be worked out in same deal, for as I say, I do not quite understand it. Coming to the question of services, there is one observation I am bound to make. I quite agree in principle that with provincial autonomy, the power of regulation, the services in the provinces should belong to the province, and that the provinces should have full liberty to Indianize the services as they desire and according to their means and circumstances. The observation which I feel bound to make, however, is this. I cannot forget that Indians are communal minded. We do hope, it is only a hope that a time will come when all Indians will cease to look at problem from the communal point of view in administrating matters which are left to their change. But that is only a hope. It is not a fact. The fact is that Indians do discriminate between class and class, community and community, and in administering such discretion as it is left to them in their administration of the law. That is a fact I cannot get over. It is a fact from which I have suffered immensely. My fear with the regard to the future constitution of India is that, having regarded to the present position of the depressed classes, having regarded to the fact that education is not widely spread among them, and having regarded to the fact that there is hardly a single individual holding a gazetted post in the Bombay presidency, for instance. A member, there is one. Dr. Ambedkar. Yes, there is one, and that is the exception, which proves the rule. You know how much trouble I had to get him in. I very much fear that this Indianization may work out as a tyranny, and therefore, from my particular point of view, I should like to emphasize that at any rate for some time, it will be necessary to maintain a British element in the services. I do not say there should be no Indianization, but I do say that, having regarded to our interests, it should be rather slower than some people desire it to be. There are general remarks that I wish to offer from our point of view. And now we are proceeding towards the third part, and the title is Depressed Classes Are a Minority of a Different Kind Requiring Safeguards. Subcommittee number 3 on Minorities in the fifth sitting on 31st December 1930. Mr. Chairman, I am sure you will readily agree that the task which has fallen upon me to represent the case of the depressed classes is a heavy one. I think it is for the first time that the case of the depressed classes from the political point of view has come to be considered. The disabilities of the depressed classes were mentioned in almost every dispatch that was recorded by the Government of India in connection with the political advancement of the country. But the dispatches only mentioned the difficulties and never attempted to give any solution of those difficulties. The problem was just allowed to rest there. In view of that, in the view of other matters, namely that in committee consisting of so many members, we are only two to voice the grievances of 43 million people, of millions of people, and grievances of which the committee will agree are unparalleled by the case of any other community that exists in India. I submit that the task is really an enormous one, and I should have expected more latitude in the matter of time allowed to me for presenting this case, but I anticipated that probably such would be the fate that would befall me as it did. Of course, at the plenary session, and in anticipation of that, I had my colleagues, Rao Bahadur Srinivas, thought it's advisable to submit to this conference a written memorandum giving a clear-cut language with what the depressed classes desire by way of political safeguards in future Constitution of India. That memorandum has already been submitted and circulated among the members of this committee, and I hope every one of them has received it. In view of this fact that the case of depressed classes, it is in possession of the member of this committee, I do not wish to ask indulgence from the chairman for a larger period of present in the case. I will therefore summarize only to emphasize what I have stated in the memorandum, which is already in the hands of the members of the committee. Sir, the first observation that I will make is this, that although there are various minority communities in India which require political recognition, it has to be understood that the minorities are not on the same plane. They differ from each other. They differ in a social standing which every minority occupies vis-a-vis the majority community. We have, for instance, the Parsi community, which is smallest community in India, and yet vis-a-vis its social standing with majority community, it is probably the highest in order of the precedence. In the other hand, if you take the depressed classes, they are minority, which comes next to the great Muslim minority in India, and yet their social standard is lower than the social standard of ordinary human beings. Again, if you take the minority and classify them on the basis of social and political right, you will find that there are certain minorities which are enjoyment of social and political rights, and the fact that they are in a minority does not necessarily stand in the way of their full and free enjoyment of those civic rights. But if you take the case of depressed classes, the position is totally different. They have in certain matters no right, and where they have any, the majority community will not permit them to enjoy them. My first submission to this committee then is that it should realize that although, to use an illustration, the minority are all in the same boat, yet the most important fact to remember is that they are not at all in the same class, in the same boat. Some are traveling in A class, some are in B class, some are in C class, and so on. I have not slightest doubt in my mind that the depressed classes, though they are a minority and are to that extent in the same boat as other minorities, are not even in the C or D class but are actually in a whole. Standing from that point of view, I agree that in some respect, the position of the depressed class is similar to that of the other minority in India. The depressed classes, although with the other minorities, fear that under any future constitution of India, by which majority rule will be established, and there can be no such shadow of doubt that the majority rule will be the rule of the Orthodox Hindus. There is great danger of that majority with its Orthodox Hindu belief and prejudices contravening that dedicates of justice, quality and good conscience. There is a great danger that the minority may be discriminated against either in legislation or administration or in the other public right of citizenship. And therefore it is necessary to safeguard the position of minority in such a manner that the discrimination which is feared shall not take place. From that point of view, however, what is asked is that the minority shall have representation in the legislation and executive, that they shall have representation in the public service of the country, and that the constitution shall provide that there shall be imposed on the future legislation of India, both central and provincial, certain limitations on the legislation power which will prevent the majority from abusing their legislative power in such a manner as to enact law which would create discrimination between one citizen and another. I say this circumstances. This danger of the discrimination is common to all minorities, and as a representative of the depressed classes, join with the demand which the other minorities have made in this regard. Now, sir, I will come to those circumstances which mark of the depressed classes and the other minority communities in India. I will at once say that the way in which the position of depressed classes differ from the position of the other minority communities in India is that in the first place of the depressed classes are not entitled under present circumstances to certain civic rights which the other minority by law enjoy. In other words, in existing situation, the depressed classes suffer from what we are called civic disabilities. I will give you just one or two illustrations because I know I have not much time at my disposal. Take the case of employment in the police or in the army. In the Government of India Act, it is provided that no subject of his majority shall be deprived of the right of being employed in any public service by reason of his caste, creed or color. Having regard to that, it is obvious that every member of the depressed class community who is capable, who is in a position to satisfy the test laid down by the employment in any public department should have the right to enter that public department. But what do we find? We find this: if depressed class man applied for service in the police department today, he is told point blank by the executive officer of the government that no matter of the depressed class can be employed in the public service because he is an untouchable person. In the case of military, the same situation obtained up to 1892, particularly by the whole of the Madras army and the whole of the Bombay army consisted of the members drawn from the depressed classes. All the great wars in the history of India have been fought with the help of sepoy drawn from the depressed classes, both in Bombay Presidency and in Madras. Yet in 1892, a rule of regulation was made which debarred the depressed classes from entry into military service. And even today, if you ask a question in the Legislative Council as to why this is done, the answer is that the bar of untouchability does not unsurpassable difficulties in the recruitment of these classes. I repeat, if you ask a question in the Legislative Council as to why this is done, The answer is that the bar of untouchability does create insuperable difficulties in recruitment of these classes. I'm quite sure that this disability is as effective as it was imposed by law, and the section in the Government of India Act which says that all His Majesty's subjects shall have free entry into employment provided that they are otherwise fit is altogether set at a naught. I can cite many other cases. For instance, there is a difficulty the depressed classes find in getting themselves accommodated in public in where they are traveling. The difficulty they find in being taken in an omnibus where traveling from one place to another. The difficulty they find in securing entry in public school to which they have themselves contributed. The difficulty they find in drawing water from a well for the building of which they have paid taxes, and so on. But I need not go into all these cases. The one circumstance which distinguishes the position of the depressed classes from that of the other minorities is that they suffer from civic disability, which are as effective as though they were imposed by law. The second and, in my opinion, the most hideous distinction which mark the depressed classes is that the depressed classes are subject to social prosecution unknown in any other part of the world. In that connection, I want to read to the subject subcommittee a small extract from report of committee appointed by the Government of Bombay in year 1928 to investigate into the position of the depressed class. That committee tried to find out whether there were any impediments in the way of the depressed classes enjoying such rights as the law gave them in common with other citizens of the state. I quote, although we have recommended various remedies to secure to the depressed classes the right to all public utilities, we fear that there will be difficulties in way of their exercising them for a long time to come. The first difficulty is that fear of open violence against them by the orthodox classes. It must be noted that in the depressed classes, from a small minority in every village, opposed to which is great majority of the orthodox who are bent on protecting their interest and dignity from any supposed invasion by the depressed classes at any cost. The danger of prosecution by the police has put a limitation upon the use of violence by the orthodox classes, and consequently such cases are rare. I again quote, the second difficulty arises from the economic position in which the depressed classes are found today. The depressed classes have no economic independence in most part of the presidency. Some cultivate the lands of the orthodox classes as their tenants at will. Others will live on their earnings as farm laborers employed by the orthodox classes, and the rest subsist on the food or grain given to them by the orthodox classes in lieu of service rendered to them as village servants. We have heard of numerous instances where the orthodox classes have used their economic power as a weapon against those depressed classes in their villages. When the latter have dared to exercise their rights and have evicted them from their lands and stopped their employment and discontinued their remuneration as village servants. This boycott is often planned on such an extensive scale to include prevention of the depressed classes from using the commonly used path and stoppage of the unnecessary to life by village banya. According to the evidences, sometimes small cases suffice for the proclamation of the social boycott against depressed classes. Frequently, it follows on the exercise by the depressed classes of their right to the use of common wealth. But cases have been by no means rare where a stringent boycott has been proclaimed simply because a depressed class man has put on the sacred thread, has brought a piece of land, has put on good clothes or ornament, and has carried a marriage procession with the bridegroom on the horse through the public street. We do not know of any weapon more effective than this social boycott which could have been invented for the suppression of the depressed classes. The method of open violence pales away before it, for it has the most far-reaching and a deadening effect. It is more dangerous because it possesses as a lawful method consistent with the theory of freedom of contact. We agree that this tyranny of the majority must be put down with a firm hand if we are to guarantee the depressed classes the freedom of speech and action necessary for their uplift. A third thing which the depressed classes fear more than any other community is that whether representation they may be granted in the new legislature, they will always be in a very small minority and consequently having regarded to the apathetic attitude of the orthodox class towards the depressed classes. There is always the danger of the interest of the depressed classes being neglected altogether or some action taken which may ultimately prove to be prejudicial to their interest. As against these special circumstances which affect the depressed classes, we propose the following safeguard. First of all, we want a fundamental right enacted in the Constitution which will declare untouchability to be illegal for all public purposes. We must be emancipated, so to say, from this social course before we can add all constant to the Constitution. And secondly, this fundamental right must also invade and nullify all such disabilities and all such discrimination as may have been made hitherto. Next, we want legislation against the social prosecution to which I have drawn your attention just now, and for this we have provided in the document which we have submitted by certain clauses which are based upon an act which now prevails in Burma. I need not go into that detail just for the moment. Then what we want is this, that liability of the executive officers of the crown of the act of tyranny or oppression shall be made effective. Today under section of 110 and 111 of the Government of India, and that liability is not real. And lastly, what we want is right to appeal against act of neglect or prejudice to the central government and following that to the Secretary of the State and Special Department in the Government of India to take charge of our welfare. This is in general the cases for the depressed classes and the safeguard that they want. Let me just say a word or two as regards the most important of them, namely their right to adequate representation in the legislature. Now, on the question of granting of representation of the depressed classes, we are absolutely unanimous that the representation shall be by election or not by nomination. The system of nomination has produced in the case of the depressed classes results which we all say are abominable. The system has been abused in the manner in which it was never expected that it would be abused, and it has never given the depressed classes the real and independent representation, which they must have as their safeguard. Under no circumstances, therefore, will be depressed classes accept representation by nomination. As to the question of joint or a separate electorate, our position is this, that if you give us adult universal suffrage and depressed classes bearing a sort of transitional period which they want for their organization, will be prepared to accept their joint electorate and reserved seat. But if you do not give us adult suffrage, then we must claim representation through separate electorate. That is our position. Now, regarding the question of the member of seat, it is not possible for us to state separately what that number should be, except to state that we will not tolerate any invidious discrimination. We insist upon equality of treatment, but the whole question, in my opinion, is entirely a relative question. It is a question that can be determined only in connection with by taking into account the seats that will be allotted to the other minority community. But I will make two observations in this connection. The first observation that I will make is this, that we, the depressed classes, demand a complete partition between ourselves and the Hindus. That is the first thing. We have been called Hindus for political purpose, but we have never been acknowledged socially by the Hindus as their brethren. They have taken to themselves all the political advantage with our numbers, with our voting strength we have given to them. but in return we have received nothing. All that we have received is a treatment which is worse than the treatment that they themselves have been accorded to other communities whom they do not call Hindus. That must be the first thing, therefore, that we want to be done. The second thing that I will say concern the question of weightage. Now, the system I will be planned in my mind has been abused. I am not against the principle of weightage. I do not accept the principle that in all circumstances every minority must be confined to population ratio. A minority may be so small that its population ratio may be given a representation which may be wholly inadequate for the purpose of its protection. It may be a representation which may be of no consequences at all. If therefore you want to protect a minority adequately and really, then in certain circumstances the principle of weightage will have to be conceded. But the distribution of the weightage must be subject to some uniform and intelligible principle. In our opinion, weightage is to be conceded because a minority is weak, either in number or because its social standing is low, or its educational standing is backward as compared with others, or because its economic strength is not sufficient to place it on a fighting par with other communities. Member, quite right, Dr. Ambedkar, but I cannot understand, for instance, how weightage can be allowed on the ground of political importance. Other member is asking or speaking, and the members speak, quite right, Dr. Ambedkar, but I cannot understand, for instance, how weightage can be allowed on the ground of political importance or loyalty or services rendered either to the empire or to the British government. I think if we adopt that principle, we shall land ourselves in very difficult circumstances from which it will be difficult to extricate ourselves. Regarding the question of the representation of the depressed classes in central legislation, if you have again adult suffrage for the election of the member of the central legislature, then of course the depressed classes will claim separate representation in legislature. Such number of seats being allotted to them in conjunction with the seat allotted to other minorities. But if your representation is to be by the suffrage which is higher or much higher based on property, and so much higher that the depressed class will probably be entirely left out, then I am afraid the depressed classes will have to claim indirect election to the central legislation and carried on by electoral college composed of members of the depressed classes in the provincial legislature, in municipalities, and in distinct local boards. That is all that I have to say so far as the depressed classes are concerned. Having said that, I need say, let me add one thing in conclusion, that this whole question of minority representation is really the crux of the whole situation. If the majority community desire that all minorities should associate with them in claiming a constitution which will give India that they call dominion status, and what we prefer of all government by the people, for the people and in the name of the people, then I am afraid that the majority community must see it to all fears of the minorities are set at rest. Otherwise, it may not be possible for us to take what I do not conceal from myself is the risk that most of us are taking in claiming of dominion status. Thank you.